Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to ENG 456, and you all know that this module is titled Prose 1. We've been doing a lot of essays in this module, and we're going to do some more before we come to the end of this module, and I feel that you have covered a sufficient number of essays and a sufficient variety of essays. We have done essays by Francis Bacon. We've also done some that were published in The Spectator and were written by Joseph Addison and Richard Steele. And in the last lecture, we started essays by Charles Lamb. And I gave you a little background of Charles Lamb, and I told you that he had a very sweet nature, a very sweet temperament, and in spite of the many troubles that he experienced throughout his life, health issues, financial issues, the fact that he had inherited along with his sister a strain of insanity that was coming from his mother's side, all these things are there in his life. But what you see in his essays is a very patient and sweet-tempered man emerging. The essay that we'll be dealing with today is titled Poor Relations, and those of you who have either been in this position of being a poor relation, or who are fortunate enough to be financially stable, and in turn they have poor relations, you will be able to relate quite a few things that Lamb is discussing here, and you'll see how different his style is in this essay from the one that we did previously, that was Dream Children, and which was actually subtitled A Reverie, and which told you or described to you a situation that was purely a figment of the essayist's imagination. Since he never got married, he never had children, so writing about children that were his own was a kind of dream that never came true. This essay, the one that I'm going to currently focus on, titled Poor Relations, is about a category of people who fall into a very different category from the ones that your other relatives will be falling into. So without further ado, let us start Poor Relations and see what Charles Lamb has to say about them. Now you see how he starts off. He's giving you phrases. He's not giving you sentences here. If you look at the slide that is being shown, what you have are broken sentences, phrases that are given. And he starts off by saying, a poor relation is the most irrelevant thing in nature. So far, so good. That's a complete sentence. And then he gives you further descriptions and definitions, and these descriptions and definitions are not complete sentences. He says, a piece of impertinent correspondency, an odious approximation, a haunting conscience, a preposterous shadow lengthening in the noontide of your prosperity, an unwelcome remembrancer, a perpetually recurring mortification. Some of the words that Lamb is using you may not be very familiar with, and this would be a good time to look it up in the dictionary. You have a lot of material that is available on the internet also, and so those of you who have access to the internet can quickly look it up. The others can open up a dictionary and see what these words stand for. The word remembrancer, for example, is not a word that is used anymore. It's used in the sense of something that reminds you of something else. Mortification, again, it's a word, it's not archaic, but it's not a word that is used in everyday English. A drain on your purse, a more intolerable dun upon your pride. A dun is a word that you will have to look up in the dictionary, okay? But I can quickly give you the meaning, and this is a person to whom you owe money, somebody from whom you've borrowed money and who has now come to claim it back. A drawback upon success, a rebuke to your rising, and rising is used in the sense of rising up in the world, your social status being improved. A stain in your blood, a blot on your scutcheon, a rent in your garment, a death's head at your banquet, Agathocles' pot, a Mordecai in your gate, a Lazarus at your door, a lion in your path, and he goes on and on. He says, a frog in your chamber, a fly in your ointment, a mote in your eye, all negative phrases. Even the biblical references that have been given, a Mordecai in your gate, Agathocles' pot, a kind of vessel that always reminds you that you are not always as rich and as established as you are now. A triumph to your enemy, an apology to your friends, the one thing not needful, the hail in harvest. Now, hail in harvest is a strict no-no. When you're harvesting crops, the last thing that you want is rain and hail, because hail is going to kill the crops where they stand. So a poor relation is a constant reminder that you were not always rich, that you did not always have the things that you do, the comforts, the luxuries of life. They were not always there. And it's a very, very uncomfortable reminder, because no person, once he has, as they say, arrived, once he has become financially established, no human being wants to be reminded of his humble origins. And Charles Lamb stresses on how uncomfortable such a person is in his very existence. Not that he is saying anything to you, not that he is doing anything to remind you, but his presence, his very existence is a constant reminder to you that you come of humble origins. The reference to Agathocles' pot. Agathocles was the son of a potter, and even when he became the ruler, he always made sure that he kept a pot by the side of his throne to remind him of his humble origins. But the majority of people do not want reminder. Okay? So he is known by his knock. This poor relation has a very special way of knocking at your door or of ringing the bell in contemporary times. Your heart telleth you, that is Mr. So-and-so. It's a rap between familiarity and respect that demands and at the same time seems to despair of entertainment. So the example that Lamb is giving you is the example from the times when people knocked on doors as a kind of permission to be allowed to enter. And so he says that when this person knocks on your door, this knock cannot be compared with anyone else. It's a very special kind of knock. And Lamb is going to continue to tell you how this poor relation is identified, how he stands out from amongst the other people present. So he entereth smiling and embarrassed. So whenever he visits you in your house, he's smiling because he's a relative, but he's also embarrassed because he's poor. Now you need to keep these two things in mind. He's related to you and he's poor. Okay? He holdeth out his hand to you to shake and draweth it back again. So here Lamb lapses into English that was more in use in, let's say, the 15th and 16th centuries, kind of taking you back to Francis Bacon's time, because as I repeatedly have been telling you, Lamb admired and tried to copy the style that had been used by the Elizabethans. And he did not think that contemporary English, that is 18th century English, was good enough for whatever it was that he was writing. So instead of the S, he uses the ETH ending. He casually looketh in about dinner time when the table is full. Now this poor relation becomes a very uncomfortable presence, not because he's present, but because he's always present at the wrong time and the wrong place. The wrong time being dinner time. You have guests in the house, you're having dinner, you're sitting down to dinner, the table is full, all seats occupied, and in walks this poor relation. So what do you have to do? That's what Lamb is going to tell you. And he says, he filleth a chair. Obviously, you have to give him a chair. And this chair perhaps was occupied by two children who were guests in your house. So you have to make sure that these two children are sitting at a separate table, although ideally speaking, you would have them sitting with the parents and with the other guests, not only to give them due protocol, but also to make sure that the parents took care of the children and the children didn't make too big a mess. But when this poor relation walks in, obviously you have to displace these two children who are guests in your house. He never cometh upon open days. Now here Lamb is referring to a tradition in which the nobility, the aristocracy, kept open house. You know, the kind of open house that you have these days in places of learning, places like universities, where your parents, your family can come, they can see what you are studying. There are stalls that are put up and that allow all those visitors to see what is being taught, etc., etc. So an open day in the house was a time and a date that was specified, let's say a week, 10 days, 2 weeks in advance, when the host and the hostess would receive guests. And so nobody was refused entry, and the whole day the host and hostess would receive guests. But this poor relation will not come when other people are coming. Although the hostess would say, you know, Mr. So-and-so is sure to come today. And then he doesn't turn up. All the other guests arrive. All the people, they come, they pay their respect. They have something to eat or drink, and then they leave after some time. The whole day you're waiting for this poor relation, and he never turns up. He remembereth birthdays, and professeth he is fortunate to have stumbled upon one. So he'll come the day you have a birthday being celebrated in the house, and then say, oh, how lucky I am, you know, I didn't know it was so-and-so's birthday. Of course he did. And he comes in because he knows there's going to be something special going on. And he wants to participate. He wants to eat that special food that has been prepared. He declareth against fish, So when there is fish, and traditionally speaking, fish was served in English households belonging to the nobility or the aristocracy. And fish is the kind of thing that is that cannot be prepared days in advance. It's cooked fresh, as cooked according to the number of people who are going to be eating it. Now, when you have counted the number of people and you've made fish, you find out that Mr. Poor Relation has turned up, and now what do? And he'll say, oh, no, I don't like fish. And then somebody says, no, but you must have some. And very nicely, he will have the fish and he'll eat it, with the result that somebody else will have to do without that fish. So very uncomfortable presence, very unwelcome presence. So whatever he does is going to be wrong, because the next example that Lamb gives you is from the occasion when after dinner in the English households wine is served for the men. So this gentleman, this poor relation, will say, oh, I'll have the port. Now the port is definitely cheaper than the claret. So he'll say, oh no, I'll have port. And then somebody says, no, you must have this glass of wine. So he'll take that also. So a very unwelcome presence. The host and the hostess do not know how to handle the poor relation, because if you are a little careless, the poor relation might become offended, and you don't want that, because after all, he is your kin, he is your relative. He's a puzzle to the servants, and the servants don't know how to address him, because the master and the mistress of the house show a lot of respect, and yet he's not dressed in clothes which you would say show him to be a respectable gentleman. And servants particularly note the way you are dressed, and they will give you importance according to the way that you are dressed. Everyone speculateth upon his condition, and the most part take him to be a tide waiter. He calleth you by your Christian name to imply that his other is the same with our own. So he's one of those very few people who in company also will address you by your first name. Normally, polite society etiquette demands that you call a man by his surname. It's only with very close friends and members of your family that you are on first name terms. But this poor relative, he calls you by your first name. He is too familiar by half, yet you wish he had less distance. So you don't want him coming that close to you. With half the familiarity, he might pass for a casual dependent. You know, you could say that he comes because he's going to get money, or he gets a regular stipend every month or every 2 months, etc., etc. So he's too humble for a friend. You can't call him a friend because he's yes, no, yes, please. He is too humble by half, yet taketh on him more state than befits a client. So he's not a client, and he's not a relative. He's a poor relative. So he falls into a category that is not easy to define. He is asked to make one at the whist table, refuseth on the score of poverty, and resents being left out. Again, if you give him importance and you try to include him in everything, he says, I can't do it. For example, you're playing cards and you're playing for money. He'll say, no, I'm sorry. I don't have any money to play at cards. And then you, because you know him, if you don't ask him to play, he will resent that and he'll think to himself, he didn't ask me because he thought I couldn't afford it. And today, see, I have money. So there's nothing that you can do right as far as the poor relation is concerned. So a very confusing personality. When the company break up, he prefereth to go for a coach and lets the servant go. So when everybody is ready to leave, he says, oh, I'll get a coach for so-and-so. But that's the job of the servant. So he'll make that offer and then he'll wait until a servant comes along or a servant is summoned and he goes and gets the coach for whoever is the guest. Now, Lamb says it's very uncomfortable to have such a person at a party, at dinner, in the house, because this one person remembers when you did not have this financial status. He remembers that you come of humble origins. He will recall your grandfather, your great-grandfather, and he'll bring up some example from the past to remind you that this money, this social status is new, and that he knows you from when you did not have this money and therefore this social status. He's blessed in seeing it now. So he talks about things which were different from what they are now. With a reflecting sort of congratulation, he will inquire the price of your furniture and insults you with a special commendation of your window curtains. And he'll say something like, oh, this furniture is so beautiful. It's so much better than that old battered sofa that you had. Or, these window curtains look so nice and new. They're so much better than the lace ones you had earlier. I never liked those. Who are you to comment on what is and is not present in the house of your host? But that's the kind of person the poor relation turns out to be. Okay? He's of the opinion that the urn is the more elegant shape, but after all, there was something more comfortable about the old tea kettle, which you must remember. He dares say you must find a great convenience in having a carriage of your own, and appealeth to your lady, if it is not so, inquireth if you have had your arms done on vellum yet, and did not know till lately that such and such had been the crest of the family. So, all in all, he is a constant and continual reminder of your humble origins. He's a reminder that you did not always have a carriage of your own, that you did not always have these new beautiful window curtains, that you did not always have this shining, comfortable, luxurious furniture, that you did not always have a crest. Now that's something that is sort of, it puts the lid on everything. As you rise in society, you remember only the good things about your past, and the rest is erased from your memory. You remember the good things and you want to continue with the good things. You don't want to remember the time when you did not have money for 3 meals a day. But this gentleman, this poor relation, is a constant reminder that everything that you have at the moment of speaking has not been there forever, has just come in, and therefore this poor relation reminds you constantly that these things are new, and that you and he go back a long way, go back many, many years. Okay? So he says that there is something uncomfortable in this reminder that is being given to you all the time by the very presence of the poor relation. His memory is unseasonable. Sometimes he remembers things, other times he does not. His compliments perverse, his talk a trouble. When he opens his mouth, you are sitting tight and you're sitting very nervous and tense. You don't know what he's going to say next, what he's going to come up with. So he's a constant reminder of when things were different, when you did not have money, when you did not have social status, when your standing in society, if not like his, was slightly better. So he's there as a very painful reminder of your humble origins. And then Lamb goes on, thus far he has established the grounds for a poor relation, and then he goes to a slightly different category and he says there's a worse evil under the sun. Just when he has convinced you that a poor relation is the worst possible thing you can encounter, he says there's something that is worse than that, and that is a female poor relation. So what Lamb is trying to say is that the male poor relation is bad enough, but the female poor relation is the worst possible thing. You can make excuses for the male poor relation, but there are no excuses that you can make for the female poor relations. He is an old humorist, you might say, and this is, something that you can say about a male poor relation. And you can say that he affects to go threadbare. He doesn't like new clothes, and that is why he goes around in these old clothes. But Lamb says there is no woman who will dress below her social standing out of choice. And this is something that people are aware of. So when they see a female poor relation, they know that she represents the actual standing of the family. As he says, you're fond of having a character at your table, and truly he is one. So you say, I like having different kinds of people for dinner, and he's such an interesting man in spite of the clothes that he wears. But you cannot make such excuses for having a female poor relative at your table. So the truth must out without shuffling. The truth will come out no matter how much you try to disguise it, because people will say something like, she's plainly related to the Lambs, or what does she at their house? Women don't go to other people's house just like that. They go only where they are wanted, only where they are related, and not to people's houses just like that. Men would go to friends' houses. Women in the 18th century did not go visiting unless there was a proper invitation or you were related. So you didn't just get up and go and visit people in their houses. She is in all probability your wife's cousin. So a very strong remark that he makes at in-laws, and in-laws not from the point of view of Pakistani in-laws, which happen to be the man's family, but here it is the wife's family that is considered as the in-laws, but the idea, the concept about in-laws and the trouble to which you have to go to keep them happy is the same. Here we talk about the husband's family. There, in the West, they talk about the wife's family. So in all probability, she is your wife's poor cousin, and there's nothing that you can do with about it, because your wife insists that you must have this person in the house. She is most provokingly humble. So she has this obsequious manner which irritate you, which frustrate you, because you know what her status is like. She doesn't have to throw it in your teeth. It's clear enough as things are. So if you send her soup at dinner, she'll say, oh, no, I don't want to have soup now. I will only have it after the gentlemen have been served. That is something that perhaps a servant would do, perhaps someone of lower social status would do. So if you try to give her importance, she doesn't like it. And if you ignore her or minimize the importance given to her, she resents it. She doesn't like it. She calls the servant sir. You don't call the servant sir, you call the servant by name. But because this is a poor relative, and because this is a female poor relative, she will insist on calling the servant sir or madam, and insists on not troubling him to hold her plate. The housekeeper patronizes her. So all these servants, they sort of talk about her behind her back, and they say, look at her, you know, she's related to Mr. So-and-so, and yet she has no money, and because she has no money, she has no etiquette. So, you know, a constant source of embarrassment. And then Lamb tells you about one particular person, that is Richard Amlett Squire, who has talked about a poor relative in very strong terms. And he says, all that exists between me and that individual is a little foolish blood. If it were not for my ancestors, I would not have this uncomfortable relative around all the time. So, and this relative, if she is older in age, she might insist on addressing him in a very familiar manner, and this familiar manner is something that puts you off totally. She has the wherewithal in the end to recompense his indignities and float him again upon the brilliant surface, under which it had been her seeming business and pleasure all along to sink him. So this poor relative talks about you as her son, her very precious son, and by doing that, she's trying to strengthen the bond that connects you. But you do not want that bond strengthened. It's she who wants it, and so she refers to you as somebody very precious. As he says, her son Dick, you know, she'll go around saying, beta this and beta that. You don't want that. You do not want to be acknowledged as being her relative, but that does not help you. Maybe Richard Amlett could take being called a poor relative's son Dick, but not all people have Dick Amlett's sweet temperament. I knew an Amlett in real life who, wanting Dick's buoyancy, sank indeed. And so then he goes on to tell a story of a person who could not take this position or this situation of having a poor relation. And it's rather pathetic, the story that Lamb tells you, because this is the story of a man who was a young man who was studying in the university and who had a father who was a tradesman, a businessman, who operated on a very small scale. Perhaps he had a shop, and so not exactly a businessman, more a shopkeeper. But because this young man was studying at university, he did not want anyone to know that his father was not as financially established. So he says that this was something that could not be helped, but this is something that emerged not immediately, but a long time after it had been practiced. So when he describes this person, he says that he had a certain position in the university, and everybody thought that he came from a good family because he could afford to study in a prestigious institution. Although he studied in this institution as what were known as blue coats, or boys on scholarship, boys who were given a stipend or money so that they would not have any issues in attending school or college or university. And he says, W went sore with these notions to Oxford, where the dignity and sweetness of a scholar's life, meeting with the alloy of a humble introduction, wrought in him a passionate devotion to the place, with a profound aversion from the society. So he didn't want anything to do with his own people. Once he got admission in the university, he wanted to forget what he had been in the past and to focus on the present, which is that he is studying in a prestigious institution, an institution of world-class ranking. And as such, you had people who had a lot of money and who had come to Oxford to study. But all such ideas, all such thoughts of trying to pretend to be an aristocrat were hollow, and they fell apart very quickly. The servitor's gown clung to him with Nisian venom. So the uniform that they were given was a giveaway that such and such a person belonged to the group of students who had free uniform and free books and free lunch and breakfast given to them because they could not afford it. So he had a lot of pride, but he did not want to remember his humble origins. He finds shelter among books which insult not, and in studies that ask no questions of a youth's finances. So this young man, he didn't tell anyone about his humble origins, but he was the kind of person who was very, very studious, and that's all that he was doing all the time. He was lord of his library and seldom cared for looking out beyond his domains. The healing influence of studious pursuits was upon him to soothe and to abstract. So he was not conducting research for some financial gain, but because he thought that it would soothe his soul, it would remove him from this area intellectually and travel to an area where he would have people of higher intelligence with whom he could communicate. The father of W had hitherto exercised the humble profession of house painter at N near Oxford. So he doesn't give you names. He believes in the sanctity of trust, and so he does not violate. He doesn't take names, but readers who were familiar with his life history, with his biography, are able to trace these people and to say such and such a character is based upon such and such an individual. A supposed interest with some of the heads of the colleges had now induced him to take up his abode in that city with the hope of being employed upon some public works which were talked of. So he has a father, and for him the father is a poor relation. So what does he do? He avoids that father and in time ignores him totally. Now, the father's temperament was exactly the opposite. Lamb calls it diametrically the reverse of his own. This student, who thought that he had come from very good beginnings and who had sort of forgotten about his humble origins, felt very embarrassed when his father came to visit and behaved like a poor relation in front of his friends, his class fellows, his seniors. So he was very, very embarrassed. Insensitive to the winks and opener remonstrances of the young man, to whose chamber fellow or equal in standing perhaps he was thus obsequiously and gratuitously ducking. So this father, he comes, he takes off his cap and he stands there and says, yes sir, how are you sir? And his son, who knows all these people, is very, very embarrassed to see his father behaving like a servant in front of these people. He's not their servant. He is equal in standing. But that is how he feels. So I stood with W the last afternoon. This is just when they were parting from each other after college was over. So when he sees his father behaving like a servant, it's like his patience gives way. And Lamb says that unfortunately this was the last straw. And he says this was something more than he could tolerate, to have his father bowing and scraping in front of his class fellows. And the last time that Lamb saw him was when he was standing with his father and feeling thoroughly embarrassed. I ventured to rally him, finding him in a better mood upon a representation of the Artist Evangelist, which the old man had caused to be set up in a splendid sort of frame over his really handsome shop, either as a token of prosperity or badge of gratitude to his saint. So what embarrasses him even further is that his father has this shop on which he has a picture frame of Luke Lamb calls him the Artist Evangelist, because he looked upon Luke as his patron saint. And Lamb says, that's the last time I saw him. Because what he did was, when he could not take this embarrassment anymore, he quietly sat down, wrote a letter to his father, telling him that he was going away and would not come back, and went and enlisted himself in the army. As he says, he accepted a commission, and he was amongst the first to be killed in San Sebastian. I do not know how, upon a subject which I began with treating half seriously, I should have fallen upon a recital so eminently painful. Lamb doesn't start off the essay so seriously. He starts it off with a light-hearted attempt at trying to describe and define how embarrassing it is to have a poor relation. And the fact that this theme of poor relationships is replete with so much matter for tragic as well as comic associations, it is difficult to keep the account distinct without blending. So it's very difficult to keep the humorous and the painful apart. They're bound to come together, they're bound to be assimilated, and that's what has happened in this instance with the essay on poor relations. And then he goes on to a specific example, and he says, at my father's table was to be found every Saturday the mysterious figure of an aged gentleman, clothed in neat black of a sad yet comely appearance. So a good-looking man, but a man who was a fixture at his father's table every Saturday, because he knew that something good was going to be made over the weekend. His deportment was of the essence of gravity, his words few or none. So he didn't talk much, he just listened. I had little inclination to talk with him. I just wanted to admire in silence. And this gentleman had a chair that was reserved specifically for him, and a peculiar kind of pudding was made on those days when he was there. That is, it was made every Saturday. All I could make out of him was that he and my father had been schoolfellows a world ago at Lincoln. So, class fellows from way back when. And that he worked at the mint. The mint is where you print money, where the coins are made. He seemed above human infirmities and passions. A sort of melancholy grandeur invested him. For some inexplicable doom, I fancied him obliged to go about in an eternal suit of mourning. So I thought that this black suit that he was wearing, he was mourning for somebody. Often have I wondered at the temerity of my father, who, in spite of an habitual general respect which we all in common manifested towards him, would venture now and then to stand up against him in some argument touching their youthful days. So his father, because he knew this gentleman, and it was a very old friendship, there were times when his father opposed him on some point, which, according to Charles Lamb, was unthinkable. This marked distinction formed an obvious division between the boys who lived above, and now he comes to a specific example of how these boys in the school were placed. So you had the boys who were called the above boys, who lived on top of the hill, and then you had the below boys who lived obviously at the foot of the hill. My father had been a leading mountaineer and would still maintain the general superiority of the above boys. So his father, because he had been a mountaineer himself and he had scaled numerous mountains, he insisted that those who were living above were smarter than those who were living below, or the below boys as he calls them. Many and hot were the skirmishes on this topic. So obviously his father brought this point up whenever the gentleman was there, because he knew that the gentleman in question had been leader of the below boys just as he had been leader of the above boys. So because they went back to childhood, they could afford to quarrel and argue, which you could not if it were just a poor relation. So this is a poor friend. In the general presence, all other cathedrals in the island, the dweller on the hill and the playborn could meet on a conciliating level and lay down their less important differences. So people who live on the top of mountains always consider themselves physically, intellectually, spiritually, morally superior. And what Lamb is trying to say is that people who live at the top of the mountains need to come down, and people who live at the bottom of the mountain need to make an effort to rise up so that they can be connected. Only once I saw the gentleman really ruffled, and here he refers to a particular occasion when the gentleman was being served pudding, and he refused because he wanted the other guests to be served first. And it just so happened that this pudding, it vanished quickly, and the hostess made a remark when the gentleman didn't want to help himself to the pudding. The hostess just sort of, it slipped out of her mouth that after all, it's not every day that so-and-so will be having pudding. And this offended the man so much that he waited for a time when he would be able to give a rejoinder. And during the course of the evening, he found a chance, and since he could not say anything else, he said, "Woman, you are superannuated." That is, you have grown old. Now that was the strongest insult that he could have given to her. So this remark stayed in his mind, and it had to have a rejoinder. And so the very same evening, he struck back at the hostess by referring to her age. And you know, in Western society in general, and particularly the time that Lamb is writing in 18th century, women were very, very conscious of their age, and they would not reveal their age to anyone. So calling a woman an old woman is the supreme insult, because it's referring to the fact that she has grown old, or she's no more beautiful, or she no more has any authority. But Lamb says that as luck would have it, this gentleman, whose name was John Billy, did not survive long after passing this comment, and it is because of that that sanity ultimately prevailed in the household. Otherwise, you don't know how far that would have gone, because no woman would take this comment seriously, and no woman would forgive a man for referring to her age in such a public and offensive manner. So John Billy died at the Mint in 1781, where he had long held what he accounted a comfortable independence. Now, he was a poor class fellow or a poor friend or a poor relative, and he says, you know, I have sufficient, as we would say in our society, Alhamdulillah, Allah ka bada fazal hai. Now, the fazl amounted to £5, 14 shillings and a penny, which were found in his escritoire after his decease. This is all that he left behind. And he died blessing God that he had enough to bury him, and that he had never been obliged to any man for a sixpence. So a very proud gentleman, and one of the things that Lamb is trying to emphasize here is the fact that pride is an essential component of a poor relation. When he has nothing else, he has pride. And it is this pride that leads him to say that I am not poor, I have enough, and what he has is just sufficient money for the burial, not a penny spare. Let's quickly go through the points that we have discussed today. This is one of those essays in which Charles Lamb discusses a universal issue, and the universal issue is that of poor relations. You cannot throw them away, you cannot make them a part of your family. They are, so to speak, independent. They don't want money from you, but they will drop in at meal time so that they can get a free meal. And the way in which they do it is not when you have guests in the house and when you've made arrangements to accommodate many different people, but such a person will always come at dinner time or when somebody's birthday cake is about to be cut, and will quickly say, oh, you know, I didn't know it was so-and-so's birthday, although it's because of that reason that he comes in. So he gives a lot of examples of who a poor relation is and how uncomfortable it is to have a poor relation. And then from there he graduates and he says that a male poor relation is bearable, but a female poor relation is absolutely unbearable, because there's no way that you can disguise yourself. When you appear in somebody's household, everybody knows that she is a poor relation. Nobody is convinced that this is a person who is dressing up as a poor relation. Women don't do that. With men, you can say, oh, well, he's an eccentric. He doesn't care how he dresses. With women, you cannot do that. And so Lamb says that the female poor relation is about the worst thing that can happen. Nothing can be worse than having a female relationship in the house, because whatever you do for her, she will want something else. If you give her importance, she'll say, no, serve the other guests first. If you serve the other guests first, she'll feel resentful because you've not given her sufficient importance. You've not treated her as a royal guest. So there is no way that a female poor relation can be disguised, because she makes blunders in speech, she makes blunders in behavior, she violates etiquette wherever she can. And it's not that she does not know how to conduct herself. She knows everything, and yet willfully she's going to come up with something that that is unbearable for you. And from that, Lamb moves on and he gives the example of Richard Amlet and how he describes his relationship with this old woman, And he says that all that exists between the two of us is a bit of blood, without realizing the significance of this relationship. So he doesn't want to have relations with people who are poor, people who are financially on a weaker footing than him. And from this example, he moves on to one where he says, I had this friend when I was studying in school, and like me, he was one of those blue coat students who got free meals and who got free books and free uniform, etc., etc. And because he was studying at Oxford, everybody assumed that he had a man, and his father could afford to send him to that university. And his father did support him. The only thing is, the father had started off as a very humble shopkeeper, businessman, and in time his business had expanded. But this fellow student could not forget the fact that his origins were humble. And so the day his father came to see him and started to bow and say, yes sir, to his son's class fellows, the son was so broken-hearted, was so embarrassed that the very next day he wrote a letter to his father saying he was leaving the country, he was going off to fight in the war. And the irony is that he was amongst the first to fall before the walls of Saint Sebastian. So what Lamb is trying to tell us is that although there are a lot of things that we have to put up with and that are pretty bad in this world, yet the worst possible thing that you can have or that you can encounter is a poor relation, because a poor relation needs to be given all the respect and reverence that is due to a rich relation. And yet you can bend over backwards, you can bend over forwards, and you will never be able to make that poor relation happy. That's it for today. Thank you for your patience, and Allah Hafiz.